Welcome back to the debate. And don't forget, you can join this debate using Twitter. The hashtag is going to come up on the screen now, so please send in your comments, your questions, your disagreements. Let's have a real debate beyond the studio. Now, I want to turn back again to some of the issues we've been discussing about this, and which really comes down to a definition of extremism, which is, some people say, again, there's a problem with this because there is a legitimate, and I think people were saying earlier on, there's a legitimate criticism you can have of British foreign policy, the wars, the occupations. But does that make you an extremist, Mohammed?
Of course not. People are entitled to have any views that they want about British foreign policy or indeed British domestic policy. And they're entitled to seek to change that policy through lawful democratic means as much as they wish.
So how would you define it then? Because the problem is that it used to be about preventing violence, and now it's this, just talk about preventing extremism, which has no workable definition.
How would you define it, Douglas? John?
Defining extremism, yeah, that's another tough one. I mean, I would tend to take it a bit closer to the violence end of the spectrum before it gets to be extremism. You know, I think anything that is, it's obviously a relational term to some extent. It's people who are on the margins of general public opinion. Now, when we talk about kind of Al-Qaeda-inspired extremism, you know, I think it's very difficult. I think it's a debate to be had. One definition could be wanting to see the imposition of Sharia law in a non-Muslim majority country like the UK, like Anjem Choudhury wants. I would say that is extremism. It's hard to come up with just one kind of definition of extremism. I don't necessarily agree with the government's definition, especially if it's classifying people extremists if they are you know, opposed to foreign policy. Absolutely not. But I think, you know, we have to kind of tease out the definitions to understand what we're talking about with respect to the far right. You know, people who want to see people, you know, who are second, third generation immigrants to the UK sent home to an origin country, that is clearly extremism. You know, anything in the realm of violence or advocating violence obviously fits in extremism.
Hilary, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, he's right. It's a very difficult thing to define, and that's the problem here. I would sort of agree that Anjem Choudhury is extreme. The people who want to send back second-generation immigrants to where they're from is extreme. But the problem is it's on a case-by-case basis, and who decides what is extreme. And in practice, what we've seen, certainly on campuses, is people being branded extremists who criticise extradition, criticise Guantanamo Bay, advocate for Palestinian human rights. So it's really being exploited, and that's inherent in this very vague, broad term, I think, and it's being used to demonise especially Muslim students.
Undoubtedly, terms like that get exploited, and in the same way that people used to be mislabelled as fascists if you didn't like them. However, there is such a thing as extremism. So if we look at Muslims, for example, somebody who believes that we should replace our democratic society with an imposed, religiously based government in this country, undoubtedly, to my mind, is an extremist. If they don't engage in any kind of violent activity, that is a perfectly lawful position to have, but they are still a non-violent extremist.
So the dividing line for you is violence?
No. There is violent extremism, which is illegal. There is non-violent extremism. You cannot stop somebody having views, which, provided they don't want to engage in violence, no matter how extreme or how undesirable or how unpleasant. But that doesn't stop them being an extremist.
Non-violent extremism? I mean,
well, yeah, I think so. For example, let's say Anjem Choudhury, the people who protest with him and hold signs up that say, behead those who insult Islam. That, I would call that extremism. Those who think that, you know, to decide that an individual no longer wants to be, this is getting into more controversial area, but to decide an individual who was born a Muslim no longer wants to be a Muslim, those who say he or she should be punished with the death penalty, I would say that's also extreme.
But that sure is violent extremism. I mean, calling for people to be beheaded or to be suffer corporal punishment.
Right, so when we're talking about non-violent extremism, that's when it gets a lot less clear and a lot less kind of fuzzy. You know, I already gave the example of wanting to see the imposition of Sharia law in the UK, a non-Muslim majority country. You know, when it becomes something, for example, wanting to see the creation of a global Islamic caliphate, I think people would disagree about whether or not that was extreme or not. I myself don't necessarily know if I would classify that as extremism. So, I think you do have to kind of tease these things out, looking at some of the specific issues that are often debated among these groups.
Anyway, I want to come back to Operation Cast Lead back in 2009, which came at a time of actually growing general radicalisation on campus, not just among Muslims, but there was widespread student occupations, the build-up to the student protests. I mean, it was an interesting time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that student rights was founded in reaction to the occupations that took place on UK campuses, protesting against Israel's bombing of Gaza and calling for universities to offer scholarships to Palestinian students and to issue statements against that.
And to disinvest as well.
And to disinvest, exactly. And so really what that encapsulates is how far really this debate is actually about politics. It's not really about religion. It's about repressing, as I said earlier as well, I think for right-wing people that universities have been a threat because they're where progressive political movements happen. And radicalisation, for me, when it's protesting for human rights, is not a bad thing. When it crosses over into violence and advocating violence, yes, we have laws against that. Universities have policies against that. But what we're seeing in practice is the narrowing of political debate, essentially.
Mohammed, politics, not religion?
People who have a political agenda, so in this case, let's look at people who are strongly pro-Israel. They will seek to weaken people who are anti-Israeli. They will do that by both legitimate means in terms of debate and also illegitimate means by name-calling, labelling people as extremists who are not really extremists. But the real world is that is what you expect in any country, over any kind of political argument. You'd find that the same thing if you went to the United States and looked at people who are sort of pro-abortion or anti-abortion. All kinds of things get thrown around as part of normal political activity in a free society. Some of them are legitimate, some are not really legitimate, they're wrong, but they happen.
Politics is a rough game, isn't it?
Yeah, and one thing I just want to focus a bit on, so the university area, sector. In our report that Demos wrote about 4 years now called The Edge of Violence, we talked about, young people are inevitably drawn to radical ideas. That's just the nature of being young. And they need to have the space to explore those radical ideas, to be bold, to be awkward. And that usually takes place in universities. And we need to make sure as a society that young people feel comfortable doing that. Now, obviously, that's balanced against, the government's priority of protecting society. But nonetheless, I think we do need to err in favor of, not suppressing radical politics and radical political views, especially at university.
I mean, Hilary, we've had a decade now of a war on terror with quite big mobilisations against the various wars we've been through. We mentioned the occupations on campus against the Israeli attack on Gaza. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is fed in. Surely this has created a degree of radicalisation for good or for bad reasons.
It has. I don't think you can control people's thoughts. You can't stop people, especially young people, from being angry about the Iraq War, Guantanamo Bay, as I said. But this war on terror fear is very useful for the right. What the actual evidence of universities supposedly being a hotbed of extremism is almost non-existent. There have been people who have been arrested and convicted under anti-terrorism legislation, and some of whom have committed acts of terror or attempted to. Who once went to university, and that really is the only evidence. But the war on terror kind of rhetoric is so bold that it's being used to repress opposition to the war on terror itself.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the evidence does suggest that it's really not. The people who carry out the bombings in London, the people who carry out this attack in Woolwich, I mean, they're not campus-based radicals. I mean, the evidence would suggest that the campuses aren't really the problem.
There isn't any real evidence on this either. I agree with Hilary. I mean, if you think of what the percentage of our society that goes to university these days, it's no surprise that amongst people who are university graduates, you find wannabe terrorists, you find child murderers, you find fraudsters, you find any kind of crime that is being committed. When that percentage of the population goes to university, you'll find people of good types and bad types amongst graduates as well. That proves nothing.
Yeah. I think we've got agreement in that. I want to come back to this sort of, I would call it almost a white noise of Islamophobia. We had Tony Blair for some reason, making a speech about Islam. I would have thought it would be best for him to keep quiet on the subject, really. It wasn't the most appropriate thing. But there does seem to be a sort of constant chorus, I would call it white noise, of Islamophobia, which exists in this country at the moment.
Well, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I think we need to be very precise about what we mean when we say the word Islamophobia. You know, just last week I spoke to someone from the Muslim community that was arguing to me that, you know, the Muslim community needed to undergo a kind of reformation. That they needed to be honest, they needed to talk about some of these issues that that were still at this point unresolved. So would you classify them as an Islamophobic? You know, I think it's a very difficult thing. Now, of course, you know, there are tensions between, let's say, the British white community and the British Muslim community. And you see that in terms of surveys asking about, you know, do you think Muslims are doing enough to integrate? You know, those are social issues. Now, with respect to kind of Islamophobia as anti-Muslim hatred, I think that's probably much lower than a lot of people tend to suggest.
And I mean, on the right of the political spectrum now, there's a sort of chorus as well that Islamophobia is political correctness and it's been used to suppress or to pigeonhole people.
I think Islamophobia is a really dumb word. It's a very confused concept, and it's a word that I never use except when I'm discussing the word. I only ever talk about anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Muslim violence when I'm writing my normal sort of political commentaries. Because what we must not do is confuse hatred of me as a Muslim. I'm a human being, I have rights. I have a right not to be discriminated against. But if somebody wants to think that my religion is a load of rubbish, they are totally free to do that. And if they want to say that my religion is a load of rubbish, they're free to do that.
Hilary, a dumb concept, Islamophobia?
It's not. I mean, if you prefer to call it anti-Muslim hatred, then fine, we'll call it that. But it certainly is a serious problem in Britain today. I mean, not just in the wake of Woolwich, not just after 7/7, not even just after 9/11, but it has been getting worse. You know,